the old copper burial site was being used here at the Oconto site between 3000 and 4000 BC, the water levels of Lake Michigan and Green Bay were about 30 feet higher than they are today. And that would have flooded most of what is now the city of Oconto, except for the far western end of the town, which is where we're at the Copper Culture State Park here. This was higher area, would have been above the water levels yet. But at the time the cemetery or burial ground was being used by the old copper people, their burial ground and probably their village site was very near the mouth of what was then the Oconto River at the time. So a completely different world that they lived in compared to what we see today. I mean, the climate would have been a little different, but certainly the water levels would have made things very different. Over here, we have an example of showing how copper was mined, a diorama of how copper was mined in the Keweenaw Peninsula of Upper Michigan and on Isle Royal in Lake Superior. That's the primary sources of native copper. And what they were after was pieces of copper that looked like this. This is vein copper. It's very rough and jagged, and it could be hammered then into whatever shape they wanted to do. They did not smelt copper, nor did they forge copper. It was heated to soften it, and then they would cool it very quickly, and it's a process called annealing, and then hammer it into thin sheets, which they can then fold in to create whatever tools they were wanting to do. The process of mining involved heating the vein-bearing stone that the copper went through, and there are hundreds of these prehistoric mining pits in the Keweenaw Peninsula of Upper Michigan. They would heat the stone, throw water on it, which would cause it to fracture, and then they could break the stone away from the copper that they were after. And some of these mining pits go 10, 12, 20 feet or more deep into the ground following these veins of copper. During the Archaic period, when the old copper complex was in existence here, the primary distribution of copper artifacts, the largest concentrations, have been in eastern Wisconsin, roughly from the Wisconsin River Valley east through to Lake Michigan. The yellow area that's on this map, which is outlined with a black outline, is the secondary primary distribution area, which is throughout the upper Great Lakes region. And that isn't to say that copper wasn't appearing elsewhere in the country, because it was a very important trade item for these people. At the Oconto site here, clam shells from the Mississippi River coastal areas were found along the Gulf, from the Gulf of Mexico, were found in the burials here. So we know that people were trading things back and forth. Obsidian has been found at an old copper burial site in Menominee, Michigan. So copper artifacts were highly sought after as trade items and very valuable to these people as trade items during the Archaic period. This exhibit here shows different types of copper tools and ornaments that were produced during the Archaic period by during the old copper complex or tradition. And what's interesting is this chart here shows the variety that were available. They had projectile points, which we would think of as spear points today. What was ingenious about making things out of copper versus stone is you could create a conical end to it, kind of like an ice cream cone shape, that you could wrap around the end of the spear point and clamp it tight. And they even had copper rivets that they attached the point with to the spear shaft itself. But because copper is much more malleable than stone is, you were limited by your imagination as to the shapes that you could come up with. And so there's an almost endless variety of copper spear point designs and forms. They also had a lot of piercing tools, and these were probably used for sewing as well as for piercing hides and things like that. They had knives. These knives were almost identical to modern knives that we see today. Knife technology has changed very little over thousands of years. And again, these would have had bone or wooden handles on them. They had earthworking tools, which were called spuds, which are obviously for digging. The woodworking tools, which is a variety of chisels and celts and wedges, were used for working woods. These crescents, some of which, there's some discussion as to what they actually are. Some were obviously knives. They would have had a handle attached, and they would have probably been used for boning animals and so forth. Others may have been ornamental, and they're somewhat similar to what we've seen in the Eskimo cultures that are called ula knives. They had different varieties of fishing tools, including an ingenious tool that was basically a harpoon point that allowed them to tie a lanyard line to a hole that was drilled in the harpoon point. And is one of the only ways you could fish large fish. And these toggle head harpoons could be using a double shafted spear, would penetrate through the fish. They would pull the shaft out, and the lanyard line would still be attached to the tool, and when you pulled it out, it would turn and it would lock into the fish. And it was perfectly, an ingenious thing, and it probably lasted a long period of time. They had different types of ornaments, including the most common ones are bracelets and hair and clothing beads. There's some examples here in our display of clothing beads as well as bracelets and conical spear points and so on. This exhibit here shows artifacts that were for the most part have been found along the shore of the Bay of Green Bay, the way where the shoreline is today. So we know that copper was still being used 2,500 years ago when the water levels finally dropped to the modern levels of Lake Michigan and Green Bay. So copper was still being used at that point, not as heavily as in the previous few thousand years, but certainly for things like awls and small points and knives and so forth, it was still being utilized. We're now at Couillardville, this Couillardville area, stretching along the river here about a mile and a half long, is full of archaeological sites, extending from the Paleo-Indian period all the way through to the historic Indian period. In the field behind us here, according to Howard Marcourt, who was an avocational archaeologist and artifact collector, there originally were 3 mounds in this field in a row. They were eventually destroyed by agricultural plowing, but they were definitely reported to him as being burial mounds. In the area across the road to our left, we know from the archaeological evidence that in the fields that are between the present road and the river, that was a large woodland period Indian village. It's full of evidence that it was heavily occupied. It doesn't mean that it was occupied continuously, but certainly over several different times over a long period of time, it was occupied by Native Americans. As were sites just a little bit further downriver, and as we'll see in a minute, around the bend of the river turns here and then goes upstream and junctures with the Little River. Give you a little background on burial mounds. In this part of the county, burial mounds have only been reported as conical mounds, that is circular shaped, almost like an up half moon kind of a shape of a mound, but whereas we don't have any reported linear mounds here, which are long elongated teardrop shaped mounds, nor do we have effigy mounds in this part of the county. So what was taking place here along the lower river valley was a little different than what was happening further north in the lakes region of Oconto County. We're here at the juncture of the Little River and the Oconto River. The Indian name for the Little River is the Oconto Sepi. Sepi means river, as in Mississippi. The Oconto, we don't know what that means. It's not a Menominee Indian name, so we don't know where that name comes from. But at this site was at one time a Menominee Indian village called Poxkinano. And it's at the junction of these two rivers, which would have been an important focal point if you're traveling, as most of them did at the time, using the rivers as water highways. Behind us is what we believe is a trail marker tree. It's an old pine that has a lower branch that was tied down at some point so that it would point in this direction with the main part of the branch going up like that. And what's interesting here is it points downriver on the Oconto. And so the village of Poxkinano, we know the Menominee Indian name for this location, was here at least several thousand years. A test archaeological excavation done by the society, the Oconto County Historical Society, a few years ago on the edge of a farm field just on the other side of these trees, produced artifacts that date back at least 2,000 to 3,000 years. So the burial mound, or the mound that was once present under the trees over here, all ties in with a long period and successive occupations of the Couillardville area along the Oconto River.